that. So, okay. So we were talking about, all right. So this is where we left off. I know I didn't get too far into it. Okay. So here you can see, all right, again, on figure 5.3, this diagram here, you can actually use this to try to kind of clarify when we're talking about epithelium, because remember, there's 4 tissue types in the body: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and of course, nervous tissue. So sometimes epithelial tissue can be somewhat overwhelming. So if you want to start off with a real basic way to look at how to classify and organize this, you can start off by using this figure here. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through each individual type of epithelium. So we're going to start off, remember we had simple epithelium and stratified epithelium. Simple was 1 layer thick. Stratified was 2 or more. And then the other types of epithelial tissue, I shouldn't say the other types, but the other part of how we classify epithelial tissue is based on the appearance of the cells in the epithelium. And so that is going to be either squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. And then we also have the transitional. So let's start off with the first type of simple epithelium, and that's simple squamous epithelial. So this is literally 1 single layer of cells that are flat. So it is the thinnest possible barrier that you can have, all right, in our tissues here. So when we're thinking of simple epithelium is great for filtration, for absorption, or secretion. So when we're talking about simple squamous, okay, this type of epithelium allows for movement of substances across its surface. So it's going to be great for filtration or absorption. So we're going to see it in areas like the alveoli, the air sacs in your lungs, because remember, we want gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen, to move across the lungs, all right, back and forth between the blood and the atmosphere. So this type of epithelium allows for that. In our blood vessel walls, all right, we refer to that type of epithelium as endothelium. And so we're going to see the lining of blood vessels are going to have simple squamous epithelium. And then, of course, we talked about the serous membranes last week when we were discussing, all right, the layers and the different cavities and what those cavities were lined with. And it was that those serous membranes. And we refer to that type of epithelium as mesothelium. And you may have heard of terms like mesothelioma. And that is going to be a type of cancer, right? That is going to be found, that's found in these serous membranes here. So if you look here at the diagram here at the bottom of the picture, the slide here, excuse me, you can see here's our simple squamous epithelium. In simple epithelium, every single cell makes contact with the basement membrane. The basement membrane is going to be found in between the epithelium and the connective tissue that's below that. And so again, now we can see kind of a cross section here through the air sacs, the alveoli. You can see how thin these air sacs are. And again, that is for the diffusion of our respiratory gases from the atmosphere into our blood and from our blood into the atmosphere. Okay, so the next type of epithelium is our simple cuboidal. Again, simple, telling us that it's 1 cell layer thick, and then cuboidal, telling us the shape of the cell. These cells are square, cube shaped. They're as tall as they are wide. Where's the nucleus? It's going to be directly in the center of the cell. Whereas with our squamous epithelium, right, you saw that its nucleus was flattened, much like the shape of the cell itself. So when we're dealing with cuboidal epithelium, its nucleus is in the middle, but it is going to be of a spherical shape. This type of epithelium, again, because it's simple, is wonderful for absorption. All right, secretion, filtration. So where are we going to see this type of epithelium? I want you to think of glands, and we'll get into the different parts of the glands. But simple cuboidal epithelium is going to be found, right, in a lot of our glands, because these glands are going to make stuff and secrete that stuff or those specific molecules. So we'll see, right, this type of epithelium in your kidneys, right, when we're seeing a lot of that absorption and secretion or excretion of substances that the kidneys are filtering out. All right, later on, we'll talk about how we have glandular epithelium that's found in some of our glands, like the thyroid gland, where we're making thyroid hormone. Also, we'll see it in the ovaries there. Right, so again, we're going to go through some of this in a little bit more detail, but keep in mind some of the characteristics of that epithelium. Here you can see that nice cuboidal epithelium. These cells are uniform in shape. You can see the nuclei right there in the center of the cell. All right, so that's a great picture for that simple cuboidal epithelium. All right, staying with simple epithelium, we're now going to change our cell shape once again and talk about simple columnar epithelium. Again, simple telling us we're dealing with one layer of cells, but now these cells are going to be taller than they are wide, much like a column that's holding up a building here. And so these cells are going to have a nucleus, as all cells or most cells do, but the nucleus is going to be found towards the bottom of the cell, or what we call the basilar region there. And it looks like an egg, okay, nice oval nucleus. So this type of epithelium is ideal for secreting stuff and absorbing things. So we have two types of simple columnar epithelium. We have non-ciliated and we have ciliated. All right, so now we have to figure out what the heck cilia is. Cilia are these hair-like structures that are attached onto the apical surface of a cell. And while the cell remains stationary, the cilia move back and forth. So the cilia move, but the cell does not. And when the cilia move, they're going to move things past the cell. And we'll explain why it does that. So let's start off with the first type of simple columnar epithelium, and that's the non-ciliated type. So on the top of our cells, we have this specialized structure called microvilli. If you're looking at it on a microscope, we describe it as a brush border. But microvilli are a special type of modification to the plasma membrane. And what we've done with the microvilli is, instead of having the apical surface, that's the top part of the cell, be flat and straight like that, what we've done is we've just made these little structures here, these modifications. And this is a horrible, horrible drawing. I apologize. My eyes are burning because this is so bad. Right? So what we've done is now, instead of having that flat, all right, top or apical surface, now we have just extended that surface up and down, up and down, and up and down to increase the surface area, but not to take up as much space. And so we have created, all right, this apical modification called a microvilli. And in this epithelium, we've stuck in these specialized cells called goblet cells. And we refer to them as a unicellular gland. What that means is that these cells, right, are glands in themselves. They're a single cell that have glandular properties. So they're going to make and secrete stuff. And what they make is glycoprotein called mucin. And so mucin, when we mix it with water, creates that mucus. So a lot of you might be experiencing an increased amount of mucus if you get a cold or around the wintry months, or if you have allergies. A lot of that is produced from these goblet cells. And so keep in mind, the cells do not produce mucus. They produce mucin. When we mix it with water, then we have mucus. The mucus helps to line the surface of these cells to lubricate it, help to make it easier, all right, for things to move across these cells. So where do we find this type of epithelium? You are going to find it in your digestive tract, pretty much from the stomach all the way down to your anus. So that's going to include stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and anus, all the way down through there. All right, and that's one single cell layer thick. So if you look here on the picture, I'll zoom in. Here you can see the columnar epithelium. Here are the nuclei at the bottom of the cells. And at the top, you can see this brush border here. And that's from the microvilli. And then every once in a while, we stick in these goblet cells. And they literally, these cells look like a glass, a wine glass. Here's the part that you drink out of, and then it's really narrow down through here. You can see it better on our drawing here. So there's the goblet cell, and at the bottom, it kind of tapers down like the stem of a wine glass here. And so these cells make that mucin, which is a glycoprotein, which is a protein with a carbohydrate group attached to it. And it secretes it out onto the surface here of the epithelium. And then the water that's out in this area, because there's water everywhere, mixes with the mucin and turns into mucus. Helps lubricate that area. So here you can see, all right, our simple columnar epithelium. Here's a nice goblet cell right over here. All right, so the other type of simple columnar epithelium is the ciliated simple columnar epithelium, which means basically at the top of these cells, right, we have cilia. And cilia are much longer than the microvilli. And so their job, again, like I said, the cell doesn't move, but the cilia do. So the cilia are going to move back and forth. And when they do that, they move the mucus around. So this type of epithelium is going to have goblet cells, because there's no point in having cilia present if they don't have anything to move. So in this case, all right, this type of epithelium have the goblet cells that are producing the mucin, which is turning into mucus. And then the epithelial cells, the simple columnar cells, have the cilia there to move, all right, that mucus around. So we're going to see this type of epithelium in the bronchioles. The bronchioles are going to be found in your respiratory system, right? As your respiratory system goes from the trachea down to the primary bronchi, that's when the trachea divides, and then they go into further subdivisions. We have our primary bronchi, our secondary, tertiary, and then they branch off into these really small tubes called bronchioles. And that's where you'll find this type of epithelium, these bronchioles here. Also, and I mentioned this last week, we talked about how the egg makes its way from the ovary, once it's released, all right, into the uterus. It has to travel through the fallopian or uterine tubes. Well, an egg doesn't have a way to move on its own, but the uterine tubes are lined with this type of epithelium, and the cilia on this epithelium move the egg or the oocyte from the ovary to the uterus. So it's really kind of a cool system here. So here you can see our nice columnar epithelium that's ciliated. And see, if you look at the top here, all right, it looks kind of like there's bites taken out of it. And that's because that's cilia. And the cilia are just in different positions here. Okay, some are standing straight out, some are shifted to the left, some are shifted to the right, right? But that is going to be your cilia. All right, now we have another type of epithelium called pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So if you look at the term pseudo-stratified, pseudo means false. Okay, so this type of epithelium looks like it's more than one layer. It looks stratified. It looks like it's two or more layers, but it's not. It is not stratified. So keep that in mind. It appears to be, but it's not really stratified here. So all simple epithelium, right, the cells are in direct contact with the basement membrane. That same rule applies to pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. All of the cells make direct contact with the basement membrane, but not all of the cells reach the apical surface. So it looks like it's stratified because of that reason. And it's because when you look at it at first glance, the nuclei are scattered all over the place. So it gives it that appearance of having several layers there. So of course, there's two forms. We have the ciliated and the non-ciliated. Look at the term. Ciliated tells you that there's cilia on top. Non-ciliated tells you that there's no cilia. So when we look at our ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, of course, there's cilia on top. This type of epithelium is going to serve as protection. Okay, so there is going to be goblet cells found there because there's cilia present. So of course, the goblet cells do what they do best. They make and secrete the mucin, which mixes with water, and then the cilia move that around. And part of that mucus that it forms is wonderful to trap pollutants, foreign particles. So we find this type of epithelium in the larger passageways of the respiratory system. Okay, so that's going to include like your nose, all right, or your throat, down into your trachea and into your bronchi. So pretty much we're going to see, all right, this type of epithelium in the larger parts of your respiratory system. So this is a wonderful type of epithelium to be present because that mucus that is present there will trap, especially if you live in a city that maybe has some pollution present. New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, right? You're going to be breathing in these pollutants, and so those mucus the goblet cells that make that mucus help to trap that in there. Now, the non-ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, this is a rare type of epithelium. So it does not have cilia, and it does not have goblet cells. It's got nothing. Okay. It also has a protective function. So we're going to be seeing this type of epithelium, right, in the male urethra. The male urethra is much longer than the female urethra, right? And also we're going to see this epithelium in the epididymis, which is that ridge-like structure that sits on top of the testes. All right, so here's a nice picture of that pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. You can see how it looks at first glance. By looking at this, you're looking, I would say, oh yeah, this is definitely stratified columnar epithelium. You can see that it's up and down and up and down. All right, but again, if you look closer, you'll see that these cells are all making contact with the basement membrane down here. But not all of these cells are making it up to the apical surface here. Now, this is a great picture because you can see, look at that, the cilia there. Nice long structures here. And then every once in a while, here we have our goblet cells. And so they're producing that glycoprotein, that mucin here that gets pushed out here into the lumen, and then it mixes with water and turns into mucus here. Then the cilia just move it away. Okay, so let's talk about now the next type of epithelium. We talked about all the simple epithelium. Let's talk about stratified epithelium. All right, so now we talked about having one layer, and then we talked about the pseudostratified, the type of epithelium that looks and appears to be layered, but isn't. Now we're going to get into when we're dealing with two or more layers of epithelium. And so that type of epithelium is going to have protective functions. So stratified squamous epithelium is the first type here. So if you look at the title, stratified, two or more layers, squamous, the cells are flat. Right? So again, this type of epithelium is great for protection, mechanical stresses. All right, so we have multiple layers. The bottommost layer will be in direct contact with the basement membrane. The apical cells will appear to be flattened, have that squamous shape. The bottom cells will appear to be cuboidal. But last week, I did say when we are naming stratified epithelium, we always look at the apical layer of cells. That's the topmost layer. And we look at the shape of those cells. And then that's what we name the epithelium. Whatever the apical layer, the cells appear in that layer, right, will tell us, all right, our classification for that. So in this type of epithelium, the bottommost layer, that basilar layer there, those cells are constantly dividing because the apical cells are usually getting sloughed off. Why? Think about it. Those cells are undergoing abrasion. Okay, when you're walking along barefoot, you're going to be scraping off those cells on the bottom of your feet. So we need to replace those cells. So the basilar layer is going to be constantly dividing so we can replace those cells. So there's two types of stratified squamous epithelium. We've got non-keratinized and we have keratinized. All right, so our non-keratinized means that all the cells in this epithelium are alive. Every single layer, okay? All the cells are alive. So we're going to find non-keratinized stratified epithelium in moist areas, okay, that are going to be present with secretions, mucus, saliva, whatever, what have you. And see, this type of epithelium, we call it non-keratinized because it does not have keratin. Keratin is a protein that cells will produce to make the cell stronger. It makes it tougher. But unfortunately, when those cells produce keratin, it winds up killing the cell, which is okay because it makes the cell stronger, and eventually that dead cell will get sloughed off and another cell will come in and replace it. But once the cell starts to create the keratin, it's going to start to die off. And so usually if you don't see a nucleus in a cell, it's that cell, I'm not saying, let me rephrase that, okay? Pretty much every type of cell in your body has a nucleus. There's a few exceptions in which we will talk about, okay? But if a cell doesn't have a nucleus, most likely it is dead or it will be dead soon. All right. So when we're looking at non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, when we're looking at it on a microscope, we will see nuclei in all the cells, telling us, okay, those cells are alive. So we're going to see this type of epithelium in areas that are entrances into your body and exits from your body. So your mouth is an entrance. So we're going to see it in the oral cavity, and we're going to see it in parts of your throat. All right, we'll also see it in the esophagus, which is that tube, obviously, that leads down into the stomach. All right. And then we're going to also see it in other areas, all right, like the vagina and anus. Because, all right, remember what I said, we are going to see this type of epithelium in areas that undergo mechanical stress. When feces are leaving the digestive system through the anus, that's a type of mechanical stress. So those cells get sloughed off. Same thing with the vagina. When you are having childbirth, right, that's a mechanical stress. When the baby is leaving, all right, through the birth canal, we're going to be sloughing some cells off. We don't want it to be one cell layer thick. We can cause a lot of damage. We want it to be many cell layers thick. Look how many cell layers, right, that we see in this picture from here down to here. That is all stratified epithelium. And you see those little dark purple dots there? All right, those are nuclei. So if we can see nuclei way down here and we follow them all the way up to the apical surface, look, you can see nuclei all over the place here. Okay, so all of these cells are living. Okay. So the other type of stratified squamous epithelium is keratinized. We'll talk more about keratinized when we get into chapter 6. All right, that's the skin. All right, but what we'll see is the superficial layers, that's the layers that are closest to the surface of our epithelium, are going to be dead. And that's because these cells have filled up with keratin. And like I said, when the cells fill up with keratin, they start to kill themselves. And so these cells will not have a nuclei present. And when that happens, that cell is no longer living. Right? So these cells start off in the bottom layer, and then they get pushed towards the surface layer, the apical layer. Right? And as they make their way to the surface, they fill with keratin, and it's kind of morbid, but they die. And so we see this type of epithelium in the epidermis, which is the outer skin layer. So when you're looking at each other, all right, you were looking at people's dead cells. That's what we're seeing here. So here's the epidermis. And so a lot of these cells here are dead. All right, and then these cells down here are going to be living. But as they move up towards the surface, they'll start to fill with keratin. We'll learn this more in detail when we get into chapter 6. And then they start to die off. All right, the next type of stratified epithelium is our stratified cuboidal. Okay, so if it's stratified, 2 or more layers, you can see the pattern here. Cuboidal in shape, we know it's as tall as it is wide. So we're going to see this type of epithelium, all right, in the tubes of structures and some of the coverings here. So we'll see it in some of our exocrine glands. So the functions of this type of epithelium is going to be for secretion. So they'll be found with glands, right? But also for protection. So exocrine glands are glands that have a duct, D-U-C-T. So there's 2 parts to a gland. There's what we call the secretory portion, and that's the part that makes whatever that gland is going to secrete. And then you have the duct, which is going to be the part of the gland that is going to move the secretions to the surface of the epithelium. So we're going to see this type of epithelium. I can't talk today. We're going to see this type of epithelium, all right, found in the walls of those ducts. So sweat glands is a great example. You have those all throughout your skin. Right? And then when you get into chapter, it's either 28 or 29, in Bio 211, we'll talk about the ovarian follicles with the oocyte formation and whatnot. But for now, just memorize that. All right, then we have another rare type of columnar epithelium, and that's the stratified columnar epithelium. 2 or more layers. The columnar cells are taller than they are wide. All right, again, its functions are going to be for protection and secretion. So that means we're going to be dealing with glands. In this case, we're going to see this type of epithelium, all right, it's going to form the duct portion of some of the larger salivary glands found in your mouth, parotid gland and whatnot. And we'll also find it in the membranous part of the male's urethra. There's 3 parts to the male urethra, okay? And so this is going to be found in the second portion of the male urethra. It's if anything, it's the smallest segment of the three parts that make up the male urethra. All right, then finally, for our last epithelial tissue, right, we have transitional epithelium. This is the transformer epithelium. We're going to find it in the urinary tract, the urinary bladder, because the shape of this epithelium depends on the state of the tissue that it's present in. Meaning, if we're going to talk about the urinary bladder, either your bladder's full or it's empty. So if it is empty, it's in the relaxed state. So the cells here, all right, that are going to be found, all right, towards the bottom of this epithelium are going to appear to be cuboidal, or what we call polyhedral. Okay, the apical cells, again, will have a rounded type of appearance. Now, when you start to drink a lot, and you haven't gone to the bathroom, your bladder's filling up, the liquid starts to fill up your bladder, or urine, excuse me, fills up your bladder and starts to put pressure all around. And so what it does is it compresses everything. So the bladder is now entering into the stretch state because, you know, like filling up a balloon with water, the balloon stretches out. The apical cells will have a flattened appearance to it because they're getting compressed. One of the interesting characteristics about transitional epithelium is that it has, all right, what we call binucleated cells, which means that the nuclei for some of these cells will appear to have not one nuclei, but two nuclei. And so another name for that is owl eyes. And so I'll show you a picture here in a second. Well, here, let me just show you. I got another picture here. I thought I did. I guess I didn't have a picture. Here we go. So here you can see, here's the urinary bladder. It's empty. So everything's relaxed and just chilling out. And you can see, all right, the cells near the basilar portion are going to be almost cuboidal in shape. So you can see this one cell has two nuclei here and here. You got another one over here. Here's another one over here. All right, so you can see these binucleated cells, but when it's empty, look, nice rounded top to the cell here. Now, when the bladder starts to fill up and things get compressed and stretched, now the apical cells appear flattened. All right, so that's because of the pressure of the urine there. So rule of thumb when we're talking about epithelia, simple epithelia is going to be best designed for diffusion, absorption, and secretion because it's thin. Stratified epithelia, right, which is going to be thicker, is going to be for protection. Just a rule of thumb. Keep that in mind. So let's talk about glands here for a few moments. Okay, we'll get into some more detail here, but I want to quickly talk about glands when we're talking about our glandular epithelium. Right, so glands, what's a gland? It could be one cell, like we saw with the goblet cells, a unicellular structure, or it can be many cells or multicellular structures here that are going to be made up of epithelial tissue. Now, there's two types of glands, endocrine or exocrine. You're going to spend a lot of time in chapter 17, right, in Bio 211 talking about endocrine glands. So I'm not going to get into much detail here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about exocrine glands. Endocrine glands, you need to know this, lack ducts. And because they don't have a duct, when they make their secretion or their hormones, they have to dump their hormones directly into the blood or into the interstitial fluid. What is interstitial fluid? Interstitial fluid is the fluid in between the blood vessel and the cells that are making these hormones. Basically, interstitial fluid is the fluid outside of cells. So if these glands are not close to a blood vessel, then what they'll do is they'll secrete their hormones outside the cell, dump it into the interstitial fluid, And then from there, those hormones will move through the interstitial fluid into the bloodstream from a close by blood vessel and then enter into circulation. So those are endocrine glands. That's chapter 17. You get to talk about that in much more detail later on. Exocrine glands, right? Exocrine glands are epithelium that have moved down into connective tissue. Now, we haven't talked about connective tissue, but normally epithelial tissue will sit on top of connective tissue. So what has happened here is these exocrine glands, this specialized epithelium, is pushed down into the connective tissue. We see it in the skin, and I'll talk more about it when we get into chapter 6. All right, but these glands, right, are going to secrete their secretions or emit their secretions onto the surface of that epithelium. And to do so, they need a duct. So down here, here's the part where we're making our hormone secretions here, and say the surface of our epithelium is way up here. So we have this tube that goes from here to up here, and that is our duct. Just like at your house, you have air conditioning, you have the air conditioning unit that makes the cool air, and then the ducts transmit that cool air to the different various rooms in your house. Well, that's the same thing here for our exocrine glands. We have a part of the gland that makes the secretions, and then we have the part of the gland that is going to transfer those secretions to the epithelial surface, which is right up here. So like I said, when we're talking about glands, we have our unicellular glands and our multicellular glands. Now, the unicellular glands, even though they're an exocrine gland, they don't have a duct per se. Okay, and the reason why is because they're so close to the epithelial surface. So they really don't have a duct. It's just really, it's an opening right there on the surface. So the goblet cell is that perfect example. Then we have our multicellular exocrine glands. Okay, obviously multi tells us that there's many cells that are going to make up this gland. So we have two parts, right? We have the acini, which produces the secretions, and then we have the duct that is going to transport those secretions to the epithelial surface. And so these type of glands are protected by a fibrous capsule. And so this fibrous capsule covers the gland, right? And it helps to offer protection, but that fibrous capsule, so here's our gland, let's say, and the red in my drawing is the fibrous capsule. Well, there's going to be parts of that fibrous capsule that move inwards to the interior of the gland, and it creates these little sections, and we call those sections, right, lobes. And these things that create those sections are called septa. They're like walls. I'll show you a better picture. I don't even know why. Oh, wait, I don't have that picture in my slideshow. Oh, bad. Naughty me. It's got to be in the other slideshow that I'll show you in the lecture. All right. So just keep in mind, all right, that those multicellular exocrine glands will have a fibrous capsule on the outside, and in that capsule will invaginate or move into the interior portion of the gland and just create these little sections or lobes. So when we're talking about our glands, right, we are going to classify them, right, based on the anatomy, right? So we have simple and compound glands. And then we also have further subdivisions. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let's keep it simple here first. A simple gland has an unbranched duct. Compound glands, those ducts will branch. And then we have tubular glands, acinar glands, and tubular acinar glands. And that refers to the secretory portion. That's the part that makes the secretions. So the tubular glands, when you hear that term, that means that the part that makes the secretions and the duct of the gland, right, they have the same diameter. So these glands will look just like a big tube like that. And usually this part here down by the end is the secretory portion, and the part that's closer to the surface of the epithelium, that's going to be the duct. Acinar glands, right, where the secretory portion is, it's going to look like an expanded sac. So it's going to look like a grape on the grapevine, like that. So there's the expanded sac there, and then this is the duct. And then, finally, we have our tubular acinar gland, and that is going to have both tubular portions and acini portions. I'm not even trying to draw that. I'll just show you some pictures here. All right. So if we look here, we break it down into our simple glands and our compound glands. All right. Remember, if it's simple, right, we have one duct here. If it's compound, we'll have several ducts. So for example, our simple tubular, right, the duct portion and the secretory portion is pretty much all the same. The diameter is relatively the same between the part that makes the secretions and the part that transmit the secretions. And then you can have a simple branch, same thing, you just have a branching portion of the secretory portion. Then you have your simple acinar. Here, the part that makes the secretion, it's expanded out like a sac here. Then obviously the simple branch, you can have several saccular portions here that all drain into a common duct. So that's for the simple glands. For the compound glands, you can see, look at all these secretory portions, and then you have several ducts. Here's a duct, here's another duct, here's another duct. That's a compound tubular because the secretory portion is the same diameter as the ducts themselves. Then you have your compound acinar. So now the secretory portion is not a tube, but it's a sac. And then we have a mixture over here, the compound tubular acinar. Some, right, you'll have long tubular portion, or you'll have these short expanded sacs here. I know it can be complicated, but again, I don't want you to worry about that too terribly much right now. All right, so let's do this. I'm going to take a break here from this, and let's do some labeling here. All right, so if you have your atlas, let's get that out. All right, and let's take a peek. All right, and then we might come back and do some more labeling here. All right, so if you have your atlas, I'd pull that out. And let's look at some of our body tissues here. Okay, so starting off with epithelial tissue, all right, let's look at the different types of epithelial tissue. So this slide here is going to be simple squamous epithelial tissue, meaning it's one cell layer thick. The cells are going to appear flattened as where their nuclei, they appear like a fried egg or a tile. You will find this in areas, all right, where diffusion, you need rapid diffusion across the surface there. So this will be great for absorption, secretion, diffusion, any of those fun things. Filtration, another one. And so where do we find this tissue? All right, in the alveoli, which are the air sacs of the lungs. It lines the blood vessels, right, and also lymphatic vessels, and we call that endothelium when it lines blood vessels or lymphatic vessels. And then we'll also find this type of epithelium in our serous membranes. Remember those membranes that cover the body cavities? We call that mesothelium. All right, the next type of simple epithelium is simple cuboidal epithelium. And so you can see here how the shape of the cell, you can see the shape of the cell is cuboidal. It's as tall as it is wide, and you can see that the nucleus is directly in the center here, and it's nice and spherical. Right, so where do we find this epithelium? We're going to find it in the secretory portions, like the lining of the thyroid gland, which is going to be glandular epithelium. In the kidneys there, right, when we're going to be seeing excretion and secretion various substances. And also we'll see it in the ovaries. So we're really going to see this primarily in the secretory regions of most of our glands there. That is a great question. Oh, love it. All right, see this big black, dark, thick line here? That is the basement membrane. In this slide here, you can see it. It's a beautiful example of the basement membrane. So that's how you can tell. All right, so, and then this is the lumen here. This is just the space here. So if these cells happen to be making something, secreting something, they'd secrete it here into the lumen, and it would go someplace. But this right here is the basement membrane, that black line there. Yep, great question. All right, so another type of simple epithelium is simple columnar. This specifically is non-ciliated simple columnar. So if you look here, you can see the epithelium is taller, the cell itself is taller than it is wide. The nuclei, all right, are going to be at the basilar portion, the bottom portion of the cell. Right? And you can see we have a goblet cell here. Here's another goblet cell over here, and the nuclei for the goblet cell are way down. Here's one, here's the other. All right, so that's non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium. And if we zoom in here, this up here, all right, is the microvilli. All right, so where do we find this type of epithelium? In the digestive tract, pretty much from the stomach all the way down to the anus. That's where we're going to see this type of epithelium. And it makes sense because remember, simple columnar epithelium or simple epithelium, absorption, secretion, what does the digestive system do? It absorbs whatever it is that we've digested. So that food and liquid that you're taking in, we're going to want to absorb it through these cells here. And so it's much easier for those substances to move through one single layer of cells than it is for it to go through 50 layers of cells. All right, so there's a goblet cell here, over here. All right, the goblet cells they synthesize, and they secrete mucin, M-U-C-I-N. And then when it mixes with water out here, it makes mucus, and it lubricates all along the top here. So we're not damaging that epithelium. Right there, you can see the microvilli right here. Now, this next slide might be troubling for some of you. It's troubling for me. All right. You'll notice how, all right, here we have the arrow pointing to the microvilli, and then over here you have it pointing to these structures called cilia. All right. So no, these cells don't have both microvilli and cilia. All right. Keep that in mind. All right. I don't necessarily agree with how the department labeled this, but we're going to use it anyways, right? Because we're limited to the slides that we can use on our tests with you folks. Don't get me started because it has to do with copyright and all this other stuff, right? Got to do everything legal. So the microvilli make up this little fuzzy border here. Remember the brush border that goes all the way over here. And then these long like projections all here and here and here and here and here. We've labeled that as cilia. Okay. So just be careful when you're taking your exam. Look at the arrow. If the arrow is located closer to the cells, right? That's the microvilli. If it's out here, away from the cells, that's going to be cilia. John, this is another example of the basement membrane. This dark brown, all right, coloration down here, that's the basement membrane. And that's what all simple epithelium sits on top of. It makes direct contact with that basement membrane. All right, so let's move on now to stratified epithelium, 2 or more cell layers. So this first one is showing you non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So non-keratinized means that all the cells are living. And these dark spots here, these are the nuclei. And if you can see nuclei here at the top, it doesn't necessarily have to be in every cell. Because when you're looking here at a picture on a slide like this, right, you have to understand you have all these cells stacked at different positions. Okay. So imagine a nucleus in each of these cells. So what I'm showing you, all right, when I make a slide like this, I'm just basically taking a slice out of those cells. And you'll notice, all right, this cell here, even though, all right, it made it into my slice, the nucleus did not, because the nucleus is over here to the left of that slice. So you'll see that some of these cells, look, there's no nucleus in here, or there's a nucleus. We don't see any nucleus here either. Okay, keep in mind when we made this slide and sliced that tissue, the nucleus could have been to the left or the right of our slice, and it just didn't make it into this picture. So that's why I always tell folks, when you're looking at the picture, always go to the top. And if you can find one nucleus, then it's going to be non-keratinized. All right, so this is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Where are we going to find this? In moist areas. Moist areas are entrances into your body and exits from your body. Okay, oral cavity, mouth, throat, the pharynx, esophagus, vagina, and anus. Pretty much where we're going to see mechanical stress. All right, areas of mechanical stress. And then here's our transformer epithelium, the transitional epithelium. So you can see here, we've got some cells with two nuclei. Here's one. There's a couple. Here's another one. You just got to look closely. They're all around. Here's another one. Well, this is a great one. All right, so transitional epithelium is going to have the binucleated cells, right? And so this is relaxed epithelium from the urinary bladder. And so the tops here look nice and rounded because there's no urine here. So we're going to find transitional epithelium in the urinary system, in the urinary bladder there. And then, of course, we have our pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Right? This is the epithelium. Now, when you look at this picture, I mean, look, all of these nuclei are at different levels. Some are above, some are below. Okay, and so it gives it the appearance. Thank you. Page 6. Appreciate that. Those nuclei give it the appearance, though, that it's several layers. Right? And this one, it is not. All right, so this type of epithelium, all the cells are in contact with the basement membrane, which is right down here. But not all of those cells manage to make it to the apical surface. And again, this isn't a high power, a highly magnified picture, but this is all cilia at the top there. And you can see a couple goblet cells are mixed in. So there's the cilia. And then here's a goblet cell. Here's another goblet cell. There's a couple more goblet cells here. So we're going to find this type of epithelium in the larger airways of your respiratory tract. Okay, nasal cavity, parts of your throat, the pharynx there, down to your voice box, which is the larynx, the trachea, and the bronchi. All right, non-ciliated is going to be more rare, and that's going to be found in the membranous part of the urethra and the epididymis. Here's a picture of that glandular epithelium. Glandular epithelium is simple cuboidal epithelium that is making glandular secretions like thyroid hormone, right? Or colloid. That's what we're seeing here. This is colloid, which is a viscous type of protein. And these cells are making it. And so that is going to then eventually become thyroid hormone when you secrete it out of the thyroid gland. So glandular epithelium is going to be found in various glands. This picture here comes from the thyroid gland. All right, then you have your stratified cuboidal epithelium. Notice, now some of you are like, what the heck? It's a hot mess. All right, so again, an easy way that I tell folks to tell the difference between cuboidal epithelium and, stratified cuboidal epithelium and stratified columnar epithelium is the distance of the nuclei from one layer to the next layer. It's very close. So for example, here is one cell, here is another cell right below it. These nuclei are relatively close to one another. Now, when we look at, I'm going to come right back to this now, when we look at stratified columnar epithelium, notice, all right, how you have one nucleus here and another nucleus here. Look at all that space in between, all right, the nuclei. Because remember, in columnar epithelium, the nucleus always sits at the bottom or the basilar part of the cell, right? But these cells are taller than they are wide. So there's going to be all this space from one layer to the next layer. So when you look here, you can see, right, we have quite a bit of space here. But when we go back to the stratified cuboidal, there's not much space, all right, between one layer and the next layer. It almost looks like they're one on top of another. Here's another one, here are these two. See what I'm saying? Very little space in between. Yeah, the base, yep, you got it. I can do that. Oh, let me get my arrow out. Okay, so your basement membrane, see this kind of pinkish line, reddish pinkish line? There's the basement membrane. Okay, you can see it a little bit better over here. Okay, so that's the basement membrane, and then the apical surface is right here on the top. This is a lumen. So when we're looking at stratified cuboidal epithelium, again, it's going to help with protection, all right, support. We're going to find it in sweat glands, primarily the ducts. So stratified cuboidal epithelium, we're going to find surrounding a lot of those ducts in our exocrine glands. Our non-ciliated stratified columnar epithelium, right, again, there's no cilia here. None whatsoever, right? We're going to find this around the larger sweat glands and salivary glands. Same type of thing, protection and secretion. All right, that is it for epithelium. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here. All right, I'm going to stop here tonight.